Good afternoon and welcome back, everyone. In this session, we will talk about the rising threat of Chinese aggression and its geopolitical ramifications. I extend a very warm welcome to the session chair, Major General Shashi Asthana, sir. Sir is a globally acknowledged strategic and security analyst and has authored over 400 publications. He was a veteran infantry general with 40 years of experience at national and various international fields and has held various key positions in the Indian Army and United Nations. Sir is the IOED representative in the UN headquarters at Vienna, Austria, and also the chief instructor at ISI of India. Shashi Sir was awarded twice by the President of India, twice by United Nations, and has also received the CEE Excellence Award for Nation Building by the Governor of Haryana. Sir was also awarded the International Diplomacy and Global Conflict Resolutions by the International Organization for Educational Development. The speakers for this session are Don McLean Gill, Resident Fellow, International Development and Security Corporation, Dr. Amrita Jash, Assistant Professor, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and Frank Leberger, Senior Research Fellow at USNS Foundation. We are delighted to have you all in our midst today. I now pass on the mic to Shashi Asthana, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, respected members of Indic Research Forum, my eminent co-panelists, a number of speakers who have spoken before us and illuminated us with a lot of information as well as education. And most importantly, the young researchers who are watching this show. And why I say most importantly, young researchers, there is a reason for that. We all look at the young researchers and the young generation with a hope that you all will produce a better world and a better India than what my generation gave it to you. And to that extent, if we can add a penny worth, it rejuvenates us, it gives us a meaning, and it gives us a cause to be relevant and to be speaking to you. So in that context, thank you very much, Indic Research Forum, for giving me an opportunity and an opportunity to interact with such an eminent panelist which I have on such an important subject. We heard with a lot of interest and education the earlier sessions, and now we are talking about a rising threat of Chinese aggression and its geopolitical ramifications. Now, let me tell you that China initially used to say that I am rising peacefully, peaceful rise of China. Then it became assertive China. Now it has become aggressive China. And if the entire world does not get together, we will see a chaotic China. And in some manner, it has already started its chaos. We all have seen and suffered coronavirus. People can keep talking about what is the origin and what is whether it can be proved or not proved. But notwithstanding that, we all know that yes, there is a problem, and we have seen the aggression. The aggression is in many phases, and China has its own logic. Now, let me start with Chinese logic to start with. China felt that there is a century of humiliation. We've gone through the humiliation. They also have, because you have to grant somebody, if he has some kind of a strategy and plan in place, you have to grant him that. They have a strategy and they have a plan in place. And why aggression? If you see the trajectory of China, it started with the Peasants' Army, then it became People's Army, PLA, and then came PRC. And everything is subservient to Communist Party of China. So therefore, Communist Party of China thinks that it owns the country. There is no doubt about it, because they think that they made PRC, and PLA also thinks that PRC came much later, and therefore we have a much greater stakes. And that is why you would find that in their system, the Central Military Commission is the most powerful body, and it remains so even today. Looking at the aims, what these aims they have set for themselves. 2049, they want to become a superpower. They also want to have a military which is a war-winning military by that time, and which can match anybody in the world. And they also want to have a developed society by 2049. And they had timelines, other timelines prior to that. Now, after Corona, they thought perhaps their time has come. Now, we may agree with President Xi Jinping, we may not agree, that's a separate issue. But he thinks that he can handle all these challenges. He thinks that he can be aggressive on many fronts, and he thinks that he can activate a number of fronts because the entire world has given him a confidence that he can gain a lot without fighting, because he has gained a lot without fighting. In South China Sea, he chose a very important time, and that time was when UN election was on. Initially, he just occupied the features, but that 1 year when the Obama election was there between President Obama and the power structure moved to the other leadership, that is President Trump's leadership, that's the time he chose. He thought that Big Bang decision will not come, and he made it a military base. Similarly, in other scenarios also, today we find that there are 3 flashpoints which are relevant ones. One is South China Sea. Second is you are having, you can see on the Himalayas, we are having a standoff between 2 nuclear powers and 2 largest armies. And it also has a connection with the Indo-Pacific. And the third one is the Taiwan Strait. So these are the 3 flashpoints. And to speak on these 3 flashpoints, we have 3 very eminent panelists who will be speaking on these issues. So I will leave it for them to deliberate further. I would request all the panelists to speak for about 15 minutes so that we can have a little more meaningful question answer session. And in case we are still left with time, I would be pleased to give you a little more time for your concluding remarks. So with that format, and I'll request all the audience and all the viewers that when you are putting your question in the chat box, also say from whom you want to ask the question so that it is easier and the panelist who is to answer, he is also better prepared having a look at the chat box. Now coming on to the first part, Mr. Don McLean Gill, he is a geopolitical analyst, a research fellow with Manila-based International Development and Security Corporation. He is also the director of a Delhi-based forum for global studies. He has got more than 80 publications to his credit, and a number of them are India related. We couldn't have had a better person speaking to us on South China Sea and the challenges there. And therefore, without further ado, over to him for his presentation as well as opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Major General Astanaji, for that warm introduction, and of course, a very important welcome on this particular topic. And of course, I wish to thank the Indic Researchers Forum. I humbly thank them for the kind invitation, and I'm very honored, of course, to share the virtual floor with dignified experts such as Major General Astanaji himself, Dr. Josh, and Mr. Leiberger to forward these important configurations on what is happening and trying to make sense really of the trends that are coming out of China in this particular moment. Now, for my particular discussion, I'll be talking about the South China Sea, the issues in the geopolitical setting in the South China Sea, which is a significant element, especially for countries like the Philippines. Coming from all the way here, the issue resonates deeply among the Filipinos and, of course, the government. Now, the South China Sea dispute, it concerns competing territorial and maritime claims, particularly on major contested features, such as, for example, the Pratas Islands, the Parcel Islands, Macclesfield Bank and Scarborough Shoal, and the Spratly Islands, which is definitely a hotbed issue. Now, the maritime dispute it really revolves around the controversial China's 9-dash line, which was established in 2009. It was officially projected in 2009. However, there were indications towards this particular strategy way before that. Now, it's important to note really that China never provided key and particular coordinates for the 9-dash line. However, it is believed to encompass around 80 to 90% of the South China Sea. Now, it is also worth noting in recent years that China has incorporated and applied and established domestic laws to reflect its ambitions, its assertive ambitions internationally, particularly in the East Asian, Southeast Asian regions. Now, the use of domestic laws really serves as an effective strategy to project ambiguity and as far as the legal situation is concerned, and to put China's maritime claims at the primary and into context in order to expand its interest and influence over the disputed maritime domain. Now, when we look into China's statements, China's written and verbal statements in form of policies, white paper, defense papers, and statements from the foreign and defense ministries, China incorporates certain terminologies that are not really recognized as far as the UNCLOS, for example, or international law is concerned. So this is part of its strategy to sort of denote an ambiguous nature towards its claims, its expansive claims in the South China Sea. So we have these terms such as sovereign control, the jurisdictional seas. The China uses the term jurisdictional seas actually to it could possibly used to describe the inland waters, territorial sea, the contiguous zones, exclusive economic zones, the EEZ, and the continental shelf, among other concepts as well. Now, these are important terminologies for China as it denotes its interests, its ambitions to safeguard its expansive interests and ambitions in the South China Sea as it continues to grow in consolidated material power. So as we can see, as it continues to grow, the level of security it incorporates to these expansive claims would also be parallel as far as actions go. Now, China's expanding assertiveness, however, we must remember, goes beyond the Southeast Asian claimants. In fact, these also affect extra-regional states that really depend on the vital sea lines of communication in the South China Sea. So what we're really facing here is, as far as the Southeast Asian states are concerned, we're looking at an extremely asymmetric power configuration between China and the Southeast Asian states. And this in itself sort of reflects the need for more coordination, cooperation among like-minded states in order to safeguard not only the rules-based order, but the stability in the region, of course, and to highlight the incorporation of international law to achieve peace among the like-minded states and sort of repel the interests of revisionist states in this particular matter. Now, we have to look into, of course, the sort of worrying trends that I'd like to call that we can see to be increasing and significantly scaling up as China continues to consolidate material power and capabilities. As we can see, of course, China's Navy is growing significantly. Its power projection with its far seas reach, for example, has encompassed beyond the Pacific Ocean. It has incorporated the Indian Ocean and beyond as well. And this is worrying, of course, for states that seek to maintain the stability of these particular maritime domains. Now, one important point which I'd like to reflect on is China's continuous and growing encroachment on the coastal states' EEZ. Now, what do I mean? Now, each state's EEZ, particularly vis-a-vis the claimants, China has been disregarding their sovereign rights, particularly as we can see with the ramming of fishing boats, for example, the sinking of fishing boats, most recently from Vietnam and a lot recently from the Philippines as well. Now, China has also been chasing away naval vessels from these claimant states that have a legitimate sovereign right over particular features of the South China Sea for resources extraction and the use of the resources in that particular region. China disregards these particular sovereign rights and sort of encompasses its overall ultimate jurisdiction over these particular features, which are in fact disputed based on the overlapping sovereign rights of particular claimant states in Southeast Asia. And this becomes a lot more complicated for states, given, of course, as I mentioned, the power asymmetry between and among China and the Southeast Asian states. So this is becoming absolutely worrisome, especially as we can see in the recent past, where China has been stepping up its game as far as its ambitions to safeguard its expansive interests in the South China Sea and beyond, especially. Now, the second point, which I want to effectively highlight, is that China continues to increase its presence around features with its vessels, be it from the Plan, the Coast Guard, or its maritime militia, which is really part of an overall gray zone tactic, as we may like to call, considering that it is diversifying its tools and instruments in order to have a stronger grasp on the maritime domain in order to safeguard its interests and to project more power. We would be expecting more of these to come, especially as I keep on mentioning, as the distribution of power continues to shift in China's favor in the region. And as it remains uncontested, these areas will be more controversial, particularly among the Southeast Asian states, which have a disproportionate capability to defend their sovereign rights in these particular areas. Now, it's important to note, however, according to UNCLOS, that innocent passage is not really considered unlawful. It's not an unlawful right of states to conduct innocent passages in the EEZ. However, if we look into the trends, if we sort of connect the dots, there's really nothing we can say that is reflecting much of an innocent perception from China with regards to its actions in the South China Sea. Now, the numbers, of course, if we look into the numbers and the persistence, the time frame of these the Chinese vessels and how they sort of try to encompass and swarm these particular areas at the expense of the states that have a claim in these particular areas, we can then see that this is far more than just innocent passage, really. And it is a form of a strategy to incorporate and consolidate, of course, and to maximize its stake and claims in the South China Sea. I could give quick examples of the recent past. We can look at the Laconia Shoals that are claimed by Malaysia, the Thitu Islands by the Philippines in the Spratlys, and most recently the Juan Felipe Reef, which is part of the Philippine EEZ, of course. China has sent in hundreds of its maritime militia to sort of swarm and to encompass the particular feature in order to sort of lay its claim and to mark its territory, of course, in this particularly contested geographic space. Now, these are, of course, few of the many instances that has sort of reflected China's ambitions in the South China Sea at the expense of the smaller Southeast Asian states. Now, another point which I'd like to mention is that China has clearly objected extra-regional states as the US, the Europeans, of course, India for that matter, to exercise navigations and other forms of freedom activities in the seas. And such behavior, of course, is inconsistent with the maritime rights of freedom vested in the UNCLOS, which in fact China ratified in the 1990s. So we can see a little irony there and a little symmetry as far as incorporation is concerned. Now, another point which I'd like to mention, of course, is that China continues to assertively consolidate its territorial claims, which really began with large-scale reclamation activity as far as as early as 2013, and it has converted small rocks and reefs, for example, into large artificial islands. And it sort of catalyzed and upgraded these reclamation activities in the form of naval and air facilities in the South China Sea, particularly in 2018. So China has begun militarizing these features in 2018, which is sort of we can say a response to the 2016 arbitral ruling, which outruled China's expansive claims vis-a-vis the Philippines and its sovereign rights to maximize the resources that it can achieve in the particular features in its EEZ. Now, this shows a sort of provocative action from China in order to show, of course, that it is not willing to accept and it's not willing to legitimize the rulings of the permanent court. Rather, it seeks to unilaterally alter the status quo through the formulation of its assertive activities, or as Major General Astanaji has mentioned, aggressive activities of China in the maritime domain. Now, in fact, it has even deployed a number of vessels and equipment, such as anti-ship and anti-craft missiles, and of course electronic jammers throughout the time. And we are expecting that this would significantly continue and increase as time goes by and as it continues to remain unchecked in the region. Now, China, again, continues to go back to its defense white paper, as a form of, as a reflection and, of course, as a justification to its activities, saying that it really can exercise its national sovereignty to build infrastructure, for example, and deploy defensive capabilities on the islands and reefs and other features of the South China Sea. However, we have to understand that China may be trying to bend the rules or sort of exploit loopholes in international law. However, we have to understand that an overall normative conduct must be looked into, of course, in order to understand how claimants can sort of interact and mingle amid the disputes occurring in the South China Sea. And this is, in fact, very important. However, China seems to disregard that and sort of incorporates a level of realpolitik in order to safeguard, of course, its expansive interests and to make sure that it remains uncontested as it consolidates and continues to consolidate material power in the maritime domain. Now, fast forward to 2020, 2021, of course. The advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, the disastrous impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of allowed China, of course, as the Southeast Asian states and other extra-regional states were busy, of course, trying to alleviate the situation within their borders, given by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. China has continuously maximized, of course, its assertive activities in the disputed areas in the South China Sea. Now, during the pandemic, however, we could see increased maneuvers from the Chinese Coast Guard, the plan, and of course, the handy maritime militia, which continue to provoke the sovereign rights of Southeast Asian claimants, particularly Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Brunei, of course. And to an extent, we can see that there have been provocations towards Indonesia, most recently as well. One of the, if I at the top of my head, one of the most recent incidents, of course, involves sending of survey patrol vessels to the North Natuna Islands of North Natuna Sea of Indonesia, escorted by planned warships, of course, destroyers, sort of threatening the local fishermen and solidifying its place in this particular area. And Indonesia is not alone in this. The Filipino fishermen continue to be the victims, of course, and the receiving end of China's assertive activities. And there are millions, of course, of Filipino fishermen that are compromised as far as their welfare is concerned. And this is absolutely shocking. And as the Philippines is going towards its national presidential elections next year, this particular issue will maintain a dominant spot, of course, in foreign policy discourses in the Philippines. And of course, this is not alone for the Philippines, but other Southeast Asian states, of course, will be able to sort of take a significant a position with this, the escalation of these events. And of course, as many of you are mentioned, the solidification of China's fishing ban is also a cause of concern, of course, as most of, if not all, Southeast Asian states rely on the fisheries and fishing. Of course, this is significantly impactful on the fishing industries of many Southeast Asian states. The Philippines has provided a sort of stark and a strong remark telling the fishermen not to significantly disregard China's unilateral fishing ban on the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And we can see this is the shift from the 2016 perspective of the Philippines vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea. And I'll be happy to answer those in the questions later on, as not to take up too much time now. Now, what has these sort of resulted in? This goes to my last point of my discussion. This has resulted in, of course, a series of cooperative and cooperative strategic measures between Southeast Asian states and extra-regional states, and they sort of converge, of course, in wanting to preserve the status quo and, of course, maintain the rules-based order in the East Asian, Southeast Asian, broader South China Sea, East China Sea areas. Now, examples of which would be one of the largest, if not the largest, military exercise between Indonesia and the United States recently. India and Vietnam also held naval exercises in the South China Sea, among other Southeast Asian states. India has also solidified its commitment to ASEAN in the India-ASEAN summit, virtual summit, regarding India's position and its maintenance of the adherence to the freedom of navigation and the rules-based order in the South China Sea. And India is, of course, becoming an increasingly important partner of ASEAN, particularly in solidifying their sovereign rights, particularly on the contested features of the South China Sea. And of course, they are looking towards India as a security provider, of course, as a capacity builder in the region. If I could provide an example, of course, the Philippines since 2017 has boosted its defense partnership with India. And we can see a lot of maritime and naval cooperative measures between the two states. And the Philippines is not alone. Vietnam, Thailand, for example, Indonesia, these states have all signaled their interest to solidify strategic and security partnerships with India, particularly in the maritime domain. Now, the United States and the Philippines also have resumed their annual Balikatan military exercise, which is a very important feature in the Philippine-US alliance, which is very important as well, considering that there were controversies regarding the visiting forces agreement between the United States and the Philippines. But like I said, the shift has occurred again from China and now back to the United States, as the Philippines can see that engaging closely with China also has its repercussions and its perils as far as sovereignty and sovereign rights are concerned. Now, of course, beyond these states, we have the Europeans, we have the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, also deeply involving themselves in the South China Sea to maintain the rules-based order, which I believe is it's a very important portion of the overall capability to maintain the safety and peace and stability of the region, and to maintain commerce and freedom of navigation, and maintaining the security of the sea lines of communication. Now, China also, on the other hand, has organized its own series of military activities with Russia, involving as much as, if I'm not mistaken, 10,000 troops. Now, and in fact, China recently, which goes to my last point, has extended its hand, of course, to solidify a comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. Now, the comprehensive strategic partnership really it's a very strong bilateral arrangement between two entities, and it sort of falls short of a treaty alliance, in fact. And a China-ASEAN agreement, from the Chinese perspective, will be able to cancel out the involvement of extra-regional states in the South China Sea dispute. So this goes out, of course, for a long-term strategy of China in order to further solidify its position and to, of course, sort of mute down the role of extra-regional states in the South China Sea. So what do all these things mean? You know, we've highlighted empirical data, we went through history and policy. Southeast Asian states, ASEAN, for an example, continues to have issues and fault lines, particularly as far as unity is
Mr.
concerned.
Gill, may I request you to conclude?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir, absolutely. This is the last sentence. And, and the need, of course, for cooperation and coordination beyond and to reflect, of course, the national interest and collective interest in stability is necessary for them and is a way forward for Southeast Asian states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gill. It was a very comprehensive and I should say a very educative presentation in which I think you have covered the crux and all the bullet points. I don't have to elaborate much. I'd just like to add that there is nothing like innocent actions of China. It was 11 dash line earlier. 2 dashes were dropped in favor of Vietnam and then it became 9 dash line. South China Sea is one of the busiest trade route in the world. And therefore, the whole world cannot allow China to make it a Chinese lake. And when they make certain features and develop certain features and start calling them island, it has to be called out and resented for the simple reason because as per UNCLOS 3, the definition of the territorial water, it touches the outer edge of your islands as well. And therefore, if you join up, if you accept China's claim, the problem is that the entire South China Sea, which has the overlapping EEZ, will become actually China's lake. So therefore, it has to be resented. The freedom of navigation has to be ensured. The whole world has to get together. There is no choice. And China has actually left no choice. It's an incremental encroachment strategy which they are adopting. And we will have to stop. We will certainly have to stop together and the whole world has to work together. Now, move on to the next flashpoint, which is the Himalayan borders as well as their relationship with the Indo-Pacific. And we couldn't have had a better person than Dr. Amrita Jash speaking on this because she has written a book on this, which is Concept of Active Defense. And she happens to be the assistant professor in Geopolitical and International Affairs, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And she is also a private and visiting fellow in Department of Policy, Cambridge University, doctorate from JNU, and she has been contributing to a number of global journals, including Diplomat. I keep reading her article, and we were students together. I mean, that's on the later side. But it's over to you, Amrita. I'm very sure that you will be able to link the border with the Indo-Pacific very appropriately. Amrita.
Thank you very much, sir. I hope I'm audible. I will try my level best to live up to the expectations. And I'll begin by extending my gratitude to Indic Researcher Forum for inviting me to deliberate on a subject which is not just topical, but we are actually experiencing in real time. And I would like to thank Major General Asthana, always good to have an interaction, and for the warm welcome, and to my co-panelists, Mr. Gill and Mr. Leiberger. So thank you, Don. I take it from where he lives because he lives at South China Sea, and take it further to the land borders. And as the subject of my deliberation is that of Chinese aggression along the Himalayas and its impact on India's Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, here the biggest say the quandary is to join the dots with that of land to that maritime, that is Indo-Pacific. But I'll try my level best to do so. I would like to start by stating that, Chinese aggression along the Himalayas is not something new. But what is noteworthy is that China's assertive posture towards securing its claims, or what it likes to claim as its own, only got aggravated in the recent times. So this is the dynamism or the trend that we see, which has been activated not just in the Himalayas, but it's in all quarters, South China Sea being one of the exemplars, and East China Sea. But more specifically, as it got demonstrated in the Eastern Ladakh crisis against India along the line of actual control, which brings in the testimony or testified by the Galwan Valley clash, which was leading to casualties and kind of fighting, leading to casualties after 45 years. So this contextualizes the debate, especially for India-China border dispute, where so far we argued that not a bullet has been fired, but the resultant is that 2020, amidst the pandemic, you have 20 casualties, and on the Chinese side, the numbers still remain unknown. However, when I put it in the broader perspective, when I look at India's Indo-Pacific strategy, I would rather be comfortable in calling it a vision, because it's still at its nascent stage, and which is not just an exception for India, but rather it applies for all countries who are championing this vision or aiming to join this vision. In this regard, the China factor, therefore, is now added to the broad range of issues when I talk of India. That is not just the bilateral connections, but rather bringing or the scope of adopting multilateralism in foreign policy making. That's how I would like to situate Indo-Pacific in India's broader vision. And this is one of the interesting turns that has been taken in India's foreign policy. So where I put in both China and the Indo-Pacific on a similar equilibrium. So this is how I would like to float the idea. Now, coming back to Chinese aggression, which I started off saying that it's nothing new. And for India, it's nothing new. We are dealing with a neighbor with which we have a protracted dispute. But the very road to Galwan in 2020 was already set. So the trajectory was already set by the preceding years, which we see in the standoffs that took place since 2013 onwards. So there was a recurrent trend. From 2013, we see it at Chumar, we see it at Depsang, Demchok, and finally, the biggest demonstration or manifestation came in the form of 73-day standoff in the Tri-Junction at Doklam, which brings into perspective all the three parties, that is India, Bhutan, and China. But who knew that, immediately after 2 years, it will be magnified, and the border dispute will rather take an intensified outlook. Because if we remember Doklam, we see that immediate aftermath, there was some kind of patch or, cooling effect felt at the BRICS forum. And we thought that, some kind of cool off has taken place. But 2020 is something unfathomable also because of the pandemic situation. But maybe because it was an opportune time, as China perceives, that, when you're more invested in your domestic politics, it's the right time to strike hard. And there's also a contextualization to this, that, when India went for abrogation of Article 370 in 2019, maybe that was also a push factor for China to, pull the plugs at Galwan when the time is right. That was during the pandemic. So Chinese aggression, therefore, can be understood in various ways, like it's not just its actions, but also its intentions. And here the intentions are very much laid out. So when I draw some deductions in seeing China's behavior along the LSE in this course of time, firstly, there are two defined principles that, China has an exceptional attitude when it comes to India, because it has settled a 12 border dispute with 12 other neighboring countries. The only exception being Bhutan and India, but Bhutan is the linkage to that of the India factor. But what makes India an exception is that when it comes to resolution of the border dispute, it has resolved, be it with the watershed principle, with Nepal, or going with the McMahon line with Myanmar, then why doesn't it apply to India? So this brings in the exceptionality, or rather, which I would like to argue, the intentions attached that, I want to test the resolve of my opponent, and which is compounded with the strategic interest, which is not so evident when you see the other border dispute. But when it comes to India, it is a multitude of factors which are strategic in orientation. So when I see the Chinese behavior along the LSE, the few deductions that I draw are like, as I would say, the China's actions of aggression, like in the past, we would like to argue that it was local in nature, but from 20 Eastern Ladakh crisis, there's something that is clear is that China's actions are not to be treated local. Rather, it is deliberated, it's premeditated. So something that we, from the Indian side, the change of mindset needs to be there in terms of rereading the Chinese actions and intentions. So, and then the following up is China's actions along the border is also in sync with its logic of salami slicing. As I draw, as Dawn has already reflected on South China Sea, this is the manifestation along the border, the bit by bit, the gradualism or incremental encroaching in the opponent's sovereign claims. So this is quite evident, and therefore the Eastern Ladakh crisis is another exemplar where China is wanting to experiment, or rather implement its salami slicing strategy. Third, what comes into our mind is that the new differences are getting added to the old claims. So if new differences are getting added, the resolution is far from being achieved. And what is evident is that a border management, which so far helped us to quell the risk, has only got worse. Its quick fixes are not helping anymore. The agreements or the CBMs have become null and void. So how do you take from it further? So therefore, in this context, the new differences are only complicating the dispute in a major way. And finally, deception is China's tool of warfare. So deception, like for instance, it flouted the agreement, and at Galwan, it literally fought with sticks and stones, going back to Stone Age. So this is also a deceiving attitude. So this is something which is very inherent in the Chinese way of doing things. So if we put, if we connect the dots, China's way or behavioral tendency or actions in any kind of dispute is kind of similar in terms of when you read its actions, its intentions. It is where that where China lays its claims. It wants to achieve it by hook or crook. So there is no space for compromise. This comes that the idea that 2006 we perpetrate that is there enough space for India and China in Asia? There is no enough space. We cannot be like China would like to believe that we cannot have we cannot have two tigers on the same mountain. But in case of India, China, it is actually two tigers on the same mountain. That is the fact that we are envisaging. So China has to accept it in somewhere, and India is giving a tough fight to China, and that is the truth of the art. So putting this into perspective, it's very much it's time that India, or rather the larger great power politics, we need to go back to our drawing board, because the new broader picture can be laid out in some postulates. Firstly, that PRC's assertive and aggressive behavior is a clear stance of its non-compromising attitude. So this applies to every country in dispute. So you cannot expect a give and take. Yes, if you expect a give and take, then you have to understand that you have to be at the receiving end and you have to give, and not the other way around. So when I put this in the India-China border dispute, it therefore, as this principle applies, there the border dispute is only protracted and the resolution comes to a standstill. So we cannot think of any kind of resolution without one interest being hurt at the cost of the other. But the reality check is that for us right now, the border management is of prime eminence. And we are nuclear forces. And we see, even if the policy, after 13 rounds of commander level talks and the dispute spilling over to the next winters, what have we achieved? We couldn't even achieve a management or crisis management mechanism in this standoff. Then where are we looking at when we are talking of resolutions? That is a completely, a doldrum or conundrum that faces both India and China. It's not just India, but China. But the only fact that it's China which puts the onus on the others. So here it comes up India that it would expect India to compromise, but not other way around. Then the dispute is no more centered on one sector. So we cannot say it's just Western sector or Eastern sector. Rather, it is also the central sector. We saw the recent, fissures also erupting in Barahoti, where we actually have exchanged the maps. And now, therefore, the LEC, every point in LEC is activated. And that also brings into, or rather reverbs the debate that new differences are getting added. And as new differences are getting added, because China is trying to change the status quo of the border. So the more it changes the status quo, we will see further overlap of claims coming into perspective. So we need to take into consideration it is the entire LSE that is activated. So the concentration should be equally at all three sectors. Aggression. Chinese aggression, as I would again start to recap, that Chinese aggression is not just about its actions where use of force is concerned. It is also very psychological. For instance, the very legislation of China's new border law is a Chinese way of applying the three warfare strategy, where you try to, humble your opponent or break the will of your opponent by fighting through various mechanisms. That is your psychological warfare, your media warfare, and your legal warfare. And this is an exemplar. And why do I say so? Because what brings into this new kind of border law, which is also a unilateral move, and also brings into this juncture, if China has an objection to India abrogating 370, which is a domestic issue of India, China comes up with its own border law, which calls out, it gives a clear-cut warning that, we will not take any form of invasion. That is the word they have used. So this comes in the context of the ongoing standoff between India and China. Also, we see a follow-up from the, lack of reaching some kind of understanding in the 13 commanders level meet, followed by the MOU signed between China and Bhutan on a three-way framework. So they are doing it parallelly, that China and Bhutan, they're trying to disintegrate the Bhutan factor from the India-China border dispute. So this brings into perspective that China is also playing aggressive with its three warfare strategy, with which India and the other actors need to be cognizant of these kind of trends that are coming in. Then, threats from China should not just be assessed from direct military actions. So, as I go further in this, because rather it is the areas that, which doesn't demand the use of force are also getting far more effective, because these are effective in the way China's to test the other's resolve, which is very much a Chinese character, that I test the other's resolve. How much, where do you toe the line? And here, the very exemplar lies in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor under the Belt and Road Initiative. So you're giving a direct challenge to India's sovereignty by putting in, or placing this CPEC running through a disputed territory, which is between India and Pakistan. That's a third country objective. So this is also, so you are not using direct force, but my actions are actually underplaying my intention that I want to unsettle you. I'm challenging you at your sovereignty in a third country perspective. So this is also a kind of aggression, which is not China's direct action as India-China border, but I can do it along the India-Pakistan border. And also, given, India and Pakistan are all-weather ties. But the other threatening trend that is coming up is the military-civil fusion, which has been adapted as China's national strategy. And this is something that India needs to take stock of, because the idea that every civilian is also having a military or a rational, or rather the dual use of technology, we need to take into consideration that how the civil and the military is now fused in China. They don't operate in a disjuncture, but they are operating as a unitary mechanism, which we lack in our case. The civil military integration is something that we need to take stock of. How do we fight China? So it needs to be a holistic approach when we read China. So therefore, when I take this broad canvas in mind, one of the visible impacts when I see in the case of India, not as I take away from the bilateral debate, is the Indo-Pacific vision. And what is interesting to note that although India champions an inclusive outlook based on inclusivity, openness, and ASEAN centrality, these are the benchmarks of India's Indo-Pacific vision. But every road leads to Beijing. That is the very fact that India is part of the Quad, which China rejects, brings forth the specifics wherein the China factor, despite not spelled out loud, is the key concern. So that's where I bring in the debate of Chinese aggression and linking it to the Indo-Pacific dynamic, especially in the context of the increasing Chinese aggression along the border. There is a rethinking that is taking place in India to redefine its priorities vis-a-vis both the new security architecture, which the world is envisaging, that is the shift from Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, which is compounded with the China factor. So this therefore brings in the co-terminus element that we are trying to pitch in when we are seeing a larger picture. And therefore India's geographical and geopolitical centrality in Indo-Pacific provides this counterbalance to China's growing presence in the Indian Ocean. And this invariably applies, therefore, to the Chinese aggression along the border. So, with my Indian Ocean and my border, that's where I am seeing a hand-in-hand approach going on, wherein the disjuncture at the India-China border is pushing India towards cooperating, with like-minded countries, where my common value system and my common security interests, specifically in the maritime domain, situates India in a closer coordination with the Quad countries, such as Australia, Japan, and the United States. And we are seeing the Indo-Pacific taking traction, especially under the pandemic. So this automatically, when India is pushing towards the like-minded country, it hinders, it automatically has a correlation to China. So it disturbs or unsettles China's interests and projects, therefore, India's tough stance on China, which believes that, as China believes that Quad represents a Cold War mentality. It calls it the external clique. Therefore, Beijing opposition to Indo-Pacific is also felt in the very way that it doesn't accept calling it Indo-Pacific, but continuing to call it Asia-Pacific. So when India joins in Quad, or any coordination at this phase, there is a direct linkage to that of the Chinese aggression at the border. So we are actually fighting both bilaterally and also in a multilateral framework. Then comes, how do I oppose China's actions? I oppose it by not joining China's Belt and Road Initiative, and rather, like India is still opposing the BRI, but rather I join in projects with Asia-Africa Growth Corridor and other which are beyond that Chinese, or in some way, counter to China's own Belt and Road Initiative. Then we see a reinforcement of New Delhi's closer ties with member states of ASEAN countries, but primarily the strengthening of India-US strategic partnership through defense ties and various. One of the direct linkages is that of signing of the BECA agreement, that is Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement in 2020, which can be seen that a direct manifestation of Chinese aggression at the border. Besides, the American arms exports to India have risen from 15 billion to from being zero to almost 15 billion USD. Plus, we are engaged into military exercises that are Tiger Triumph and that of Malabar exercises. So it brings into perspective that what has led the strengthening ties have taken a magnified dimension and more strategic orientation. Apart from India-US ties, we also have India-Australia ties, which which upgraded itself to comprehensive strategic partnership and other engagements. So I'm just winding up, and therefore this brings into perspective that Chinese aggression and the Indo-Pacific alignment of India. As I would like to conclude by suggesting that every step forward by Beijing in changing the status quo, be it at the border with India or the larger geopolitical map, will keep Beijing in a challenging position when we consider its great power ambitions. So India's championing for free and open Indo-Pacific unsettles China, and more China attempts to push the security envelope, it will only make its own nightmares in terms of Cold War mentality far more actualized. But therefore, keeping China in mind, India is changing its priority outlook when it comes to both its national and global interests. But I would like to conclude by saying that while China is one of the factors behind Indo-Pacific strategy, India's Indo-Pacific strategy, however, it is not the only factor. On that note, thank you so much for your patience.
Okay, thank you very much. I think very well put across a very broad canvas. You've covered in a, I think, very precise form. I'd just like to add a few points. One, China feels that for China-centric Asia, Indian subordination is necessary. India doesn't feel so, and that's why there is a tussle.
Yes.
Second thing is that between India and China, the stance on the borders have been hardened so much that there is a cost, there is a political cost to give anything, and which no government, whether in India or in China, is ready to meet, because that's too heavy a cost. And therefore, this border can only be resolved when for China, the political cost of not resolving a border exceeds the political cost of resolving the border. When it comes to the connection, let me also tell you in no uncertain terms that Himalayas is a stalemate kind of situation, irrespective of what kind of technology and what kind of drama they do there, irrespective of what kind of three warfare strategy they apply. The question is the terrain friction of Himalaya will only bring a stalemate. Nothing more can happen there. And therefore, the vulnerability of China lies in Indian Ocean. It lies in Indo-Pacific. And for all the lines of communication of China, they have to pass through Indian Ocean where the vulnerability is. And that's why China can keep saying string of pearls strategy and all these strategies. These are basically Chinese insecurities which they want to address because they know that their vulnerability lies at a place which is not really under their control. More so, if they have pushed India to a situation wherein it has collaborated with navies of all over the world, and all the navies are trying to put pressure on China, which China has asked for itself. It has nobody else to blame. Now, with this, we move on to the next flashpoint, and that is Taiwan. And for that, I think we could not have a better speaker than Mr. Frank, who is an acclaimed sinologist. I'm given to understand that he has got a degree from ICS Paris. He has a vast experience of working in Taiwan. He has been actually working on the spot, whether in Hong Kong or in Tibet or in China. And he has got a hands-on experience on all these. And he has also been focusing on a fair amount of, I think, humanitarian work in Tibet. So he was also a senior fellow in Usana's Foundation and has got many articles to his credit. So without further ado, I will request him to take on the last subtopic of this session.
Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Frank, are you there? Yeah, Frank, you are muted, I think. Frank, you are muted, I think. Frank, you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
All right.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry,
You are on. You are on
sorry
now.
for the small delay. I'm going right to the point. Time is precious. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for having me here. And today I'm going to talk about Taiwan, a place that I know very well since I've been there first time in 1981. So I'm going to talk about this for something 20 minutes, and it's going to be from the perspective of Taiwan. So nowadays, the People's Republic of China, PRC, is openly threatening to invade the democratic island of the Taiwan. It's an island nation and officially known as the Republic of China, or ROC. Yet the cautious government of the Taiwan ROC has not yet severed any links with shared Chinese traditions, and therefore has not declared independence, despite the fact that a majority of people on the island consider themselves Taiwanese and not Chinese. So an independence move, which would automatically lead to Taiwan renaming itself Republic of Taiwan and dropping the ROC. This is dangerous for Taiwan because the PRC has threatened to invade, to make war on Taiwan in such an event. So there are 5 other triggers for an automatic Chinese attack, according to the annual Pentagon report entitled Military and Security Developments Involving the PRC. It was published just 10 days ago on November 3rd. However, Taiwan will not surrender. Even if their supposed Chinese brothers start a war. And the island nation of Taiwan is determined to preserve its freedom, as the Taiwanese defense minister has stated recently. The regime of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, is led by Xi Jinping. And even with the Taiwan government being very careful not to provoke Xi Jinping, he is increasingly belligerent and threatens to invade the island nation using his 975,000 strong Liberation Army, People's Liberation Army ground force. Xi Jinping's goal is to reunify Taiwan with the PRC, despite the fact that Taiwan has never been part of the PRC. Yet even with this huge PLA, Xi Jinping can order as he likes. Xi Jinping is incapable to reunify Taiwan, which is protected only by a small army. Why is the PLA incapable? So, due to topographical and geographical reasons, the mountainous island of Taiwan is very easy to defend and difficult to invade, thanks mainly to the treacherous Taiwan Strait. Just 125 kilometers separate China coast and Taiwan at the narrowest point of the Taiwan Strait. Then Taiwan has a small number of harbors and beaches where invasion troops could safely land, such in a 1944 D-Day style landing. PLA ground forces can only field about 400,000, less than half, in a war theater facing Taiwan. And Taiwan would have something like 90,000 troops, excluding large reserves contingents they have in Taiwan. All this is summarizing the dictum. Taiwan is easy to defend and hard to attack. And the Chinese call this 易守难攻. In World War II, the Allied Command decided not to invade Taiwan and bypassed it. After 1950, Taiwan Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek turned Taiwan, and the tiny outlying islands of Quemoy and Matsu into impregnable fortresses. During the last 70 years, the PLA has tried but never succeeded invading and occupying even these small, tiny islands of Quemoy and Matsu, located just a few kilometers off the Chinese coast. This proves not only the military genius of Taiwan ROC, but also reveals the fears of CCP leaders that the rest of Taiwan could declare independence in such a case, an unacceptably high political cost for the CCP. And today, the modern PLA is plagued by systemic flaws, such as lack of warfighting experience, inefficient coordination among branches and units, and inadequate training, such as incapable frontline commanders. By the way, this is the PLA's own assessment, it's not from me. Therefore, the threats hurled by Xi Jinping against Taiwan are actually empty threats. Everybody in Taiwan knows this, and the 23 million inhabitants of Taiwan are not fearful or not overly worried. The proof is Taiwanese stock markets are not crashing and people are not panic buying food. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chief of Staff, has said that the PRC was unlikely to develop capabilities that would enable retaking Taiwan during the next few years. Nevertheless, Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader in history who is hell-bent on annexing Taiwan, not on invading, but on annexing Taiwan, no matter the cost. In China, this annexation is called reunification, and Chinese have been vigorously brainwashed that this is a pseudo-religious endeavor which will somehow rejuvenate China as a nation. China is hell-bent on doing things, and Xi Jinping has also personal vanity and hubris, who he pushes himself to enter Chinese history books as the great reunificator. And this is a pun on the word Terminator. Xi Jinping's preferred Taiwan annexation scenario is one without war. Such a strategic option is known in Chinese as 不战堕台, annexing without fighting. Yeah, so annexing without fighting. It is relatively low risk and low cost because any PLA attack on Taiwan will automatically draw in superior US and Japanese forces. Tokyo has already made it clear it will mobilize and help Taiwan. Just 4 days ago, the Supreme Commander of US forces in Indo-Pacific inspected missile bases on the small Japanese island of Yonaguni. And Yonaguni is just 100 kilometers east of the east coast of Taiwan. And he was there during US-Japanese joint war games held in the vicinity. Japanese missiles are already deterring Chinese ships from attacking the sparsely populated east coast of Taiwan. And today, just today, the Australian Defense Minister has said that his country will join the US military action to defend Taiwan. For the PRC, annexing without fighting means that it will use a combination of diversified gray zone threats with both military and non-military approaches that exploit a limbo between peace and war. Non-military activity includes pinprick harassment on the high seas, like civilian speedboats running Taiwan Coast Guard. This is quoting, I'm quoting the ROC National Defense Report of 2021, just released a few days ago by the Taiwan government. Okay, China is also exerting legal, political, and diplomatic pressure on Taiwan and all on her remaining few allies, combining the use of political warfare, information warfare, cognitive warfare, as well as cyber, media, and psychological warfare. The aim is corrupting, confusing, and manipulating the general public, plus co-opting influential elites, including scientists and technological specialists from both inside and, of course, outside of Taiwan. Under such a scenario, Taiwan government authority will be gradually corroded and society fragmenting internally under relentless external pressure coming from China. On the Taiwan's 23 million inhabitants, roughly 70% are majority political convictions are critical of China. Yeah? And they consider themselves Taiwanese and not Chinese. Yet there is a minority of people who is pro-China, and they are often manipulated by an influential fifth column. This fifth column includes entrepreneurs, businessmen, influencers from media or right-wing political parties, such as the nationalist KMT party and other splinters, plus the organized crime groups in Taiwan. They in turn are guided by various covert CCP influence agents, mostly members of the secretive Chinese Communist United Front Department. Yet, the irony is that the United Front tactics have not worked in Taiwan for 30 plus years. Therefore, the PLA has been shifting into a more belligerent modus operandi, including frequent violations of Taiwan's air identification zone, with military assets circling the islands and displaying military might, like aircraft carriers, new planes, drones, and cruise missiles. This is in fact psychological war, including posturing and war games which disrupt normal communication lines. The aim is to drive a wedge between Taiwanese citizens and their government. In future, perhaps also mock attacks staged near US bases in Guam and Japanese Okinawa using missiles or ships and planes. The PLA's area denial measures, known as A2AD, rely heavily on its arsenal of conventional missiles, including the carrier killers Dongfeng 21D and Dongfeng 26. Their role is to prevent that US carriers enter Taiwanese waters to disrupt Chinese operations. Xi Jinping hopes that his strategy would entice the Taiwan to give up and restrict US forces movement. US administration, politicians should lose precious time. They should become overcautious, restricting US force movement. Finally, Xi Jinping hopes that the US would waver in its determination to support Taiwan, as required under US-Taiwan Relations Act and soon be passed US-Taiwan Deterrence Act, which should grant $2 billion annually to the Taiwan government until 2032, just to buy advanced American arms. Nevertheless, Xi Jinping envisages to isolate Taiwan, wear it down psychologically, and then dictate the terms of surrender on the negotiation table. China would also spread defeatist narratives in an information war and increase pressure for reunification. This strategy is called use the army to force negotiations, or 以武比谈. Xi Jinping uses this already, but he ignores its dismal results. The West Korean movement demonstrates that Dongfeng missiles represent no threat to to them. Also, public opinion in Taiwan and neighboring Japan increasingly reflects a spirit of resistance against Chinese bullying. Xi Jinping's most high-risk, high-cost strategy would be a shooting war, which is called use war to force surrender. In Chinese, 以战必降, easily culminating into an escalating spiral in 6 steps by design or accident. The 6 steps start with hybrid war based on Mao's People's War concept with civilians such as China's militarized fishermen with their huge fleet of more than 10,000 fishing boats, blockading, swamping, and harassing Taiwan's outlying islands, which are Quemoy, Matsu, the Pratas, Penghu Island, and Taiping in the South China Sea. Then the next step would be escalating to military occupation of just one outlying islands, let's say Quemoy. If they would do this, if Taiwan would not surrender. Step 3, partial maritime blockades on the main harbors or on the outlying islands, using massive amount of military and civilian vessels, plus drones, robots, and mines, using anti-access A2AD capabilities to prevent US forces intervening. Step 4, full blockade, sealing off Taiwan entirely, trapping panicked civilians and foreign nationals on the island, combined with electronic warfare, cyber attacks, and information warfare. This could divide Taiwan society and manipulate international public opinion. Xi Jinping could then also be tempted to use China's arsenal of 200 plus nuclear arms to blackmail Taiwan into surrender, and at the same time to threaten the US to withdraw their forces from or near Taiwan. However, this is improbable, as China would have to reverse its current doctrine of nuclear non-first use, but if used, it would have very grim global consequences. The fifth step is a short, limited conventional war, for example, bombarding harbor facilities, government and military installations using overwhelming conventional missile attacks. And finally, a full-blown war with airborne and amphibious D-Day style invasion. Again, potentially with nuclear blackmail. Yeah? This blackmail would then be the most extreme, incalculable, and destructive option. And indeed, this year, the Pentagon report I just mentioned at the beginning states that the PLA aims to have nuclear capability of 700 warheads by 2027, in 6 years. Perhaps she thinks that this number is sufficient to scare off the US and bringing about the surrender of Taiwan. Should this be the case, it would be wishful thinking, because there are already troops in Taiwan. American troops are already in Taiwan. Now, if Taiwan would surrender, and under any of these scenarios I just cited, the island nation would be lost to the free world. This would inevitably result in a geopolitical earthquake with far-reaching negative consequences. And there are 5 causes for this. The first cause, the crucial geostrategic location of Taiwan, including maritime choke points. Taiwan is the keystone and the midpoint of the first island chain. This chain is stretching from the Japanese mainland southwards towards Indonesian Sumatra. This geopolitical feature perfectly fences in China since 1950. Even today, it denies the PLA Navy an easy and unhindered access to the open ocean. Taiwan plays the geopolitical role of keystone and gatekeeper inside the island chain. For example, the sole gateways or choke points through which Chinese submarines can enter directly into the open ocean, open West Pacific, are the two international waterways of Miyako Strait in the northeast of Taiwan and the Bashi Channel south of Taiwan. The day when China totally controls Taiwan, the PLA could project naval power right to the doorstep of America. For example, PLA subs can then enter undetected right into the Western Pacific from new naval bases located on the Taiwan east coast. Then there's the second island chain. It starts south of Tokyo and continues via the American Northern Marianas with Guam, then to Palau, and it ends in Indonesian part of Papua New Guinea. This chain would also disintegrate. As a precaution, US forces are now they are now preparing in Guam to use missile defense made in Israel. Yeah, so this is new. This is very interesting. So the U.S. Secretary of the Navy, his name is Carlos del Toro, has recently stated that China was already threatening the U.S. capacity to operate in the waters around Taiwan, international waters. This includes also the maritime zone between the first and the second island chains. The effects of letting China annex Taiwan without a war or with a war unopposed would be that the US could lose all foreign policy credibility. And then the status of global military power. The strategic balance in the Western Pacific would be changed beyond recognition, China could interdict all force movements within the first island chain. In a worst case scenario, the US could not anymore effectively protect its allies, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. Those three countries would then face the stark choice, becoming either a Chinese puppet state or to develop nuclear war to defend themselves. With an emboldened China, the US would then gradually lose naval control over the entire Western Pacific, way beyond the second island chain. If other allies, like Australia, were to become Chinese puppet states, this would cause the US to lose superpower status, effectively ending America as we know it. The PRC, however, would gain great power status or replace the US as sole superpower. A very frightening prospect indeed. So the second cause is the crucial location of Taiwan near trade routes and vital sea lanes of communication. Every year, goods worth of trillions, something like $3 trillion are shipped via sea lanes in the East and South China Seas, including all the waters around Taiwan. With China annexing Taiwan, it could then control the island's economy, gaining even more leverage on trade and commerce with all countries in Asia. China can then coerce Asian countries by disrupting their economies and ways of communication. China would become the uncontested #1 in world trade. Third, the crucial status of Taiwan industry in the global supply chain. Taiwanese high-tech manufacturing, electronics, IT, and the green power industry, very, very new, are top in the world. And they occupy an important position in the global supply chain. After annexing Taiwan, China could control global production and distribution or allocation of the necessary raw materials to all those countries. Then China could easily dictate or manipulate the global drive for green tech, including decarbonization and vehicular electrification, just to cite one example. Number 4, the geopolitical impact of Taiwan's advanced microchip industry. Nearly every electronic item in the world needs advanced microprocessors, and they come from Taiwan because Taiwan is the home of the global giant called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. It alone accounts for 50% of the world production of the best and the most advanced microchips. TSMC dominates the world market, and Korea and Samsung are only a distant second. Any advanced industry in the world is dependent on microchips made in Taiwan. Therefore, this is a product of geopolitical importance. The Sino-US trade war already itemized TSMC as a weapon because it uses American IP, American patents, and machines in the production process. Most major shareholders of TSMC are also Americans. Therefore, the last Trump administration was able to starve China of all advanced Taiwanese microchips. And these are used in Chinese planes, military planes, missiles, robots, cars, ships, whatever. After annexation by China, the Chinese could turn tables on the US. This is probably the reason why US Secretary of the Navy Del Toro said reportedly that the loss of Taiwan would threaten the economic security of the USA, meaning no more microchips for American arms industry, AI, bioengineering, innovative green industries. By annexing Taiwan, the PRC could become a semiconductor powerhouse overnight. For decades, China has been technologically incapable of manufacturing advanced microchips because they lack innovation and lack the know-how. Okay, to wrap it up, number 5, last not least, the ideological and moral importance of a free Taiwan. Free Taiwan is the first free, open, peaceful, pluralistic, and affluent democracy created by Chinese people in the whole world. With a per capita income of $35,000, China, on the other hand, is a closed, tumultuous, totalitarian dictatorship in which 600 million Chinese, or half of its inhabitants, must subsist on $120 a month. If China annexes Taiwan, it will drag the society down to its low level and destroy the healthy social fabric in Taiwan, same as now happening in Hong Kong, nearby. In case of a civil war with Taiwan, Xi Jinping will be remembered as a slayer of Chinese. When they all are supposed to be brothers, Xi will then become the victim of his own success, and he will be remembered as the initiator of the 3rd or 4th Chinese Civil War, or the terminator of Chinese progress. However, ordinary Taiwanese are determined not to let Xi Jinping get away with this. The resolve of all Taiwan people, including the army, is the most crucial factor preparing to fend off any annexation attempt from China before or after 2027. And the resolve is rising in the face of naked Chinese aggression and harassment. This gives rise to great hope for the future of a free and democratic Taiwan. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That's all.
Sir, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. It was a very exhaustive and a very realistic analysis. I would put it this way.
Yes. Thank you.
And you did cover the Chinese aspect extremely well, all the dilemmas which China has. And I think all it remains for me is just to give a small, shall we say, exposure of the other side. As far as US is concerned, this is the last chance to prove that it is the superpower. Taiwan is not Hong Kong. Taiwan has all the wings of the armed forces. And you rightly mentioned yourself that this, Xi Jinping knows that if Taiwan is taken by force, whether he wins or loses, as far as he is concerned, he is gone. That is the stakes which they hold. This is an analysis which was published in South China Morning Post by their strategists, and this was the analysis which I also published, almost on the similar lines.
Yep.
The US has maintained a strategic ambiguity. The damage which Xi Jinping has done is that by coercing Taiwan, it has emboldened Taiwan greatly. The capacity building of Taiwan is, as of now, so much which as it has never been before, and US is fully prepared. As you yourself mentioned, if you break the first island chain, Japan is next. Nothing will stop Japan to go nuclear, and Japan, US and Japan, they know that they have to contest the first island chain, because if they lose the first island chain, there is a hell to pay. Secondly, China can never compete or become number one as far as, because China is not self-sufficient in energy, it is not self-sufficient in food, it is not self-sufficient in so many things. Whereas US has got self-sufficiency in energy, self-sufficiency in food and everything, and virtually no threat. Whereas China has a border with 23 countries. So there is a lot which China still has to manage. And Taiwan is not easy. What they are waiting is that if DPP government change, somehow keep coercing Taiwan so that President Tsai does not declare independence, continue in this stage, keep harassing them as much as they can, and if they get the KMT government in place, then they have no problems, because they were working with them very efficiently earlier as well. So this is what their game plan is. They still want to win without fighting. I don't think they are going to fight. That's my take. Taiwan is something in which everybody has his views, and all views are respected. So I will leave it there, because there's hardly any time for question answers. I don't see very much in the chat box as well. And after every speaker, I've been analyzing it. I've been giving my points as well. So I don't think I need to sum up. So I think I will thank all the panelists for a wonderful presentation which they have done. I'm sure everybody would have been benefited, and it was a pleasure for me to interact with all of you. And I think we'll leave it for the next session. So we'll welcome the next session and learn from them. Thank you very much.